The diagram in front of you describes the initial setup of a synthetic CLO and the main cash flows and contractual undertakings that take place at inception. The parties involved are the following: Bank ABC, which has identified a portfolio of $4 billion of loan exposures to its U.S. and Canadian customers, on which it wishes to acquire significant default protection. Ignore for now the other numbers you see as you go down the box for Bank ABC. We can think of Bank ABC as the risk originator in this diagram. The borrowers under the loan facilities are referred to as the reference entities, or sometimes simply as the obligors, and the loans themselves are referred to as the reference obligations, or sometimes simply exposures. The next parties in the transaction are the OECD bank and the note investors, both of whom we can think of as risk takers who wish to earn yield by selling credit protection on a large percentage of Bank ABC's loan exposures. And the last major party to the transaction is the SPV in the middle of the diagram, which acts as a sort of conduit for transferring some of the portfolio's credit risk from Bank ABC to the investors by, as we shall see, issuing a series of notes to those investors whose performance is linked to the performance of the loan portfolio. We can regard the SPV as a risk repackager. We assume, for our discussion, that the notes and all the loans in the portfolio have exactly a 3-year maturity. The instruments that effect the transfer of credit risk are the two credit default swaps, also assumed for now to have a 3-year maturity, and whose other specific terms we will address a little later. For now, it is sufficient to think of these instruments as contracts that transfer some defined amount of the portfolio's credit risk to the SPV and to the OECD bank, subject to a number of conditions and limitations. No cash is exchanged upfront under these CDS contracts, although in reality some sort of margining arrangement is usually entered into pursuant to standard ISDA documentation in order to diminish the risk of non-performance by either party. In terms of initial cash flows, the investors purchase the various notes from the SPV for cash in an aggregate amount of $280 million, and the SPV immediately invests this cash in AAA floating rate securities issued by a G7 government or government agency which we assume yield LIBOR flat. These securities are normally referred to as the collateral for the transaction. During the 3-year course of the transaction, and assuming for now that no defaults at all occur, the flow of cash is easy to visualize. Bank ABC pays a periodic fee, usually quarterly, to the OECD bank that can be thought of as the premium or price for the credit protection it has acquired under the senior CDS. Bank ABC also pays a second fee, much larger in percentage terms, to the SPV as the premium for the protection it has acquired under the mezzanine CDS. This second fee is then added to the LIBOR coupon received by the SPV from the collateral, and the aggregate cash now in the SPV is passed on to the note holders, who receive different spreads over LIBOR under their notes depending on their level of seniority. Detailed illustrations of these coupon calculations and cash flow allocations are provided later. On the maturity date of the notes, which is also the maturity date of the CDS contracts, the collateral either matures or is sold into the secondary market, and its proceeds are passed on to the note holders in full redemption of their notes. Remember that we have been assuming that no credit event or default whatsoever has happened during the 3-year life of the transaction. The most critical aspect of the transaction is the mechanism for transferring credit risk under the 2 CDS contracts, which is discussed next. Step 1 in this discussion requires the parties to the CDS contracts to define the scope of protection bought and sold. The term credit event is used for this purpose and is normally defined to include either a bankruptcy filing by a reference entity or a payment default by a reference entity under its reference obligation. Some transactions may define credit event more broadly to include, for example, a situation in which the reference entity restructures its debts following a period of financial distress, or in some other cases where the debt of the reference entity is downgraded to a level very close to outright default. From time to time in our presentation, we may use the term default to refer to a credit event because it is shorter, but please do remember that bankruptcies and possibly other events that may not necessarily involve a payment default are often covered by the CDS. Step 2 determines a process for calculating the damages, so to speak, that ABC Bank is deemed to have suffered as a consequence of the default. This is accomplished by requiring a calculation agent to solicit bids, usually 30 or 60 days after the date of the default, for the reference obligation, and to use some predetermined averaging or other arithmetical process to translate those bids into a single percentage, which will be considered to be the obligation's recovery value. The loss suffered by Bank ABC is then deemed to equal the size of its exposure under the reference obligation multiplied by 100 minus the recovery value. This amount is aggregated with all similar amounts calculated in this manner for all earlier defaults until the total of all these amounts comes to exceed $40 million. This $40 million threshold can be thought of as a first loss position retained by Bank ABC, and is sometimes referred to as the equity tranche. Before this $40 million amount is reached, nothing different happens to the collateral or under the notes, and the cash continues to flow among the parties exactly as described previously. If, however, the $40 million threshold is exceeded, the SPV is required under Step 3 to liquidate collateral in an amount equal to this excess and to pass on the proceeds to Bank ABC as compensation for the credit event that has pushed our previous calculations to exceed the $40 million threshold. This process is repeated following every subsequent credit event. Bids are solicited as before, the deemed loss suffered by Bank ABC is calculated in the manner described before, and collateral is liquidated in the market in the necessary amount, with proceeds passed on to Bank ABC as further compensation for these additional defaults. Step 4 recognizes that collateral removed from the SPV under Step 3 is collateral that will not be available at maturity to redeem the notes held by the investors. Therefore, it becomes necessary to write down the face value of the notes by the amount of cash paid over to Bank ABC following each credit event above the threshold. These write-offs, logically enough, are applied in reverse order of seniority. That is to say, they are applied first to the Class D notes, then, when the Class D notes are exhausted, to the Class C notes, and so on. These write-downs also mean that the coupon paid under the affected note is, going forward, calculated by reference to the reduced face value of this note. In a similar vein, the notional amount of the mezzanine swap is written down by a corresponding amount, and the premium paid by Bank ABC to the SPV under this mezzanine swap is now calculated by reference to the reduced notional amount. In the very remote event that all the notes, including even the Class A notes, are written down in full, then further losses under step 3 above will now be allocated to the OECD bank. Given, however, that the collateral has been completely depleted by then, Bank ABC would be assuming here the credit risk of the OECD bank and its ability to meet these payment obligations under the senior CDS. It is for this reason that a margining arrangement is often entered into, requiring the OECD bank to post margin in amounts that typically increase as the number of credit events rises, and therefore the probability that the OECD bank may be called upon to meet a compensation payment becomes increasingly relevant.